Okay, welcome to the next, and it's not the last lecture. We will have one lecture more about artificial intelligence, Python, which will be in February, which will be given live or not, we will see. But now the lecture about social network analytics. That's something I was touching already when measuring networks, when speaking about centrality. It goes back to 20 years of research I do. It has been developing to one of the most important disciplines. I mean, it started in mathematics with solving some network problems maybe 200-300 years ago. But the first studies for social networks and using social networks were actually done in social sciences, actually in psychology. The first sociogram, the thing with the points and the lines, was first presented in the 30s in the United States, showing an emotional map of humans towards each other from Moreno. Then it was used often in the 40s and 50s and 60s. So there were some studies, Horton studies, other studies, which actually employed social networks as a kind of method. It is on the one hand side a kind of visualization tool, showing people or whatever elements in some lines. Also products can be disassembled, break down in components and subcomponents and displayed with interfaces. So also a product is nothing more than a network. And with the development of digital products, technology, of course, the World Wide Web, online social networks. So the network word became a word everyone is using, and research was using it more and more. Where in the 60s we have looked for the diffusion of innovation in social networks. The epidemiologists have looked for the diffusion of viruses in social networks. It's, by the way, not so different in looking at innovation or a virus. The spread in social networks is quite similar. Then we have looked at teams and groups and departments and behavioral variables. But then many other disciplines were using that. In biology, every cell, our brain, is nothing else as a network of proteins or a network of cells. In literature it was used because you can display every book, every setting, every theater play in networks. And now also in physics and many disciplines, social networks are used. It's a common technique. It's something to display something, to describe something. But behind it, there is also a lot of mathematical operations up to statistical methods that have been developed on networks. Because you can imagine that classical statistics were asking everyone and relating everyone to certain variables. In networks, we can also speak about triads and dyads. So we are not taking the individual, we are taking a pair of individuals that are interlinked, or we are taking a triad that are interlinked, that show a level of transitivity in a triad as we would label it. And the classical method in getting networks, as I have done it at my PhD, was going to the people, here is a team, here are the team members, and now you indicate how many times you communicate about a certain thing with the team members. That's the easiest way, based on surveys, questionnaires. That was a classical method for many researchers to do that. Nowadays, we don't do that anymore. Why should we? We take the World Wide Web in scraping the data and getting the data from there. I mean, you can go at every social network in getting all data to create social networks, calculate on that, do something with that. You could use your individual communication for actually creating your own individual network. So we are using more and more electronic data for that, because most communication and most interaction takes place in a digital world. But you could construct something like that, as I have shown shortly before, and then you create a network. It matters behind a sociogram is always there. So the matrix is used for calculating a lot of things. The matrix is there for displaying it. And you can actually think of, we will introduce a software in the end of that, that can be modeled in many ways and that can be very manipulative. That's the algorithm behind determines how that all is displayed. I can display it as circle, I can display it with distances, I can make points smaller and larger. So you have a lot of network displays, illustrations that are biased to one or another way, depending on the algorithm which is responsible for this graphic. Here an example from literature. Actually, what is it for a book, for literature? This name should give a little indication of it. It's Hamlet. Probably none of you did read it. Did someone read it? I had to read it at school. Was not the most favorite piece of work I read. But you also can display Hamlet, which is also a theater play. You can display it as network. And you can define certain roles. But I say you have really central actors. I mean, Hamlet is pretty central. It's quite obvious that Hamlet is central. The whole book has the name Hamlet. But there are other actors around which are more periphery. Some of them are more in between, being on the passes of all information. So you have actually different roles and different configurations. You could say something about the entire network, and you could say something about different roles. And these different roles might have implications. Some people are more influential by having a certain network role. Other people are more creative by having a certain network role, by having very diverse information from very different sources. So there are very, very different positions in networks which determine how an entire network is functioning and how certain individuals in networks are functioning. And in network terms, we generally distinguish between the theories describing closeness in networks and the theories describing openness in networks, and there are some other special measures. Closeness theories say social capital, where we speak about, appears to very strong and close contacts in a network. Which means you have a lot of contacts, you have strong contacts. The contacts are reciprocal. That means that a friend of you also labels you as friend in a network. So it is actually a two-sided kind of network. So someone at Facebook that likes you, you like as well, as a reciprocal relationship. That's closeness. On a team level, it would be a high degree, a lot of ties between these actors, a high density, a high reciprocity, so everyone is actually feeling the same for everyone else. That's closeness. Closeness produces trust. Closeness produces social capital in the feeling of being supported, of being integrated, of being embedded. So it has many, many positive sides. But the contrary also has positive sides. So social capital can also be created by openness. So that means not being strongly embedded in one group, but being in between. Having many, many friends from many, many different groups, playing music there, doing sport there, having the friends from your former village, school, town where you are from, having maybe some other hobbies. So you have many, many different people in your network with many, many different groups. That makes you somehow in between. You're not strongly in one group, you are in between. That's betweenness centrality. That's a kind of openness. And the best way is if these groups you are connected to don't have other connections. So that's labeled structural holes or network efficiency, also labeled as a broker position you take in networks. And that also counts for whole networks. You can actually take the entire network and look whether it's a quite close network or it's a more open network with a lot of structural holes and clusters. Actually, every larger network, like the World Wide Web, and every larger community on social networks is an open network, depending on clusters that are quite close and being actually linked with bridges or people in between. That's the general structure of networks. Networks are never all in the size close. Networks are clusters which are connected to each other. And then you have some other structures that are considered. Structural equivalence means if some persons who might not even know each other have exactly the same network configuration, are they similar in certain positions? And that seems to be the case. Not only persons, you can take cells in your body that have the same networks, do the similar job. Also others is subgroups, clans, which looks at these clusters. If the network is really clustered in something which is labeled in subgroups of clans, or transitivity, which looks at triads, stable or unstable triads. So is a friend of mine also the friend of the other friend, and is the other friend also my friend? Do I have a stable triad or do I have an unstable triad in social networks? The easiest thing is some sub-features in networks, a line or a subgraph. Here you have a triad which is stable because it's fully interlinked, and you have a line, two people being connected. For the rest, if I take that as group, it's a quite low density. So it's a quite open group, which not many links or ties when I would consider it on a group level. About triads, a triad can be completely disconnected, but it can be connected in certain things, and that says something about a stability. If A likes B and A likes C, it's the best for the triad if C also likes B and the other way around. Otherwise, you have a quite unstable triad. That counts also for trust, for communication, for many, many things. And you could take in social network research the triad as a base of your research instead of individuals. That makes it different to classical research. What's also important is the shortest path. Let's say we have this network, and what's the shortest path between, for instance, F and G? That's important because you can calculate the shortest paths between all possible links of points. Between all persons in these networks, you can calculate the shortest path, and the shortest path would be labeled geodesic distance. And a lot of network calculations are based on geodesic distance, which describes the shortest path. And that directly relates to centrality. When you have the shortest geodesic distance to all others in this network, you are highest on betweenness centrality, because it means that the most information is flowing in the quickest way via you. And it makes you very central in terms of betweenness, not in terms of having the most contacts. You're in between the most information in this setting, which is an important variable. A bridge is called a line, like here between 8 and 3. When I disconnect this line, this networks would be disconnected in this case. That are just terms that appear. So we have this centrality, what I was showing before, because it's an important difference. If someone is central, Diane is central, having the most contacts, and Diane mostly is the influential person. Diane is very close in this group. She will influence behavior, which is an important variable. That's a kind of opinion-leading variable. Particularly, some generations younger than me trust more what they get of information from peers and the behavior of peers rather than classical marketing. So it is actually important she's a kind of influencer in the small group, as you have also quite bigger influencers. Heather, in a contrast, it's not very active in their network, but is positioned in a way that she gets the right information or the most information in this network. So she's actually quite high in betweenness, because she also receives that string of information. But she's probably not the most influential person, but according to theory, she might be the most creative person in the network when we look at it. So you have also networks classified as centralized or decentralized or distributed, which refers more or less to something which comes to statistics as well. When you want to test certain network structures, you need also a null hypothesis. And that's a quite difficult thing. We will come to that. How do networks, when I want to test a certain structure, a block or a social network, and I want to say, okay, this structure, this network is more centralized. What would be my null hypothesis? It's very difficult to define that because we need a general imagine of a structure which could always serve as null hypothesis from which something has to deviate to actually form a certain structure we find. Another thing is structural equivalent. That means if two persons have exactly the same network configuration in social networks. That's also used for behavioral variables and for many explanations. That's a theory which, when you go into social network analytics, which is quite central, the structural whole theory, that's from an American sociologist, Ronald Burt, which says, okay, what can you do to optimize your own personal network? And your network normally has some redundancies. So you are connected somehow to the same group with several people, so you get the same information several times. So it's actually quite redundant. It would be sufficient getting it once. So how do you get your network more efficient? Having not so many contacts, but having more information, and with that also more control in a network. Burt speaks of control and information benefits here. And for most, that means actually getting more people to know, so networking. But it also creates more redundancy. As more people you get to know, it's more likely it is that those people know each other as well. And that creates more redundancy in your own network and does not make it more efficient. That makes it more efficient by creating holes, being connected to unconnected groups. So with that, you have 4 contacts, but you reach 16 other people and the information of those people. The theory behind it is that, of course, you have some limits in time and intensity when you do so. So creating networks that are most efficient, which connect you to most different groups that are unconnected, creating the least redundant information. And that theory is labeled structural holes theory in social network analytics. So actually, when you have a network like that, you should reconstruct it as that. And that counts on several levels, on the individual level, on a startup level, on a company level. It is more efficient. There is a lot of empirical research done that leads to making a better promotion, a faster promotion, being more successful as company, being more successful in professional terms as human being, as individual. And it creates in this way social capital by having a very open network. It might not help you when you're sick or you need certain help. With that, those networks might not create any support. But for your professional way, those networks might help and create this capital, social capital you need. That's one string of explanation of social networks, but you have to keep in mind when looking at openness. Networks can be more or less efficient. By the way, I had one PhD thesis about that, and it turned actually out that for startups, investing in many contexts and more contexts does not really pay off. It's also a nonlinear feature. You need some efficiency in dealing with networks, otherwise it will cost you much too much time without any results. So having thousands of contacts does not really propel what you want to do and does not really propel the achievement of goals. So a trade-off, it's actually needed. By the way, there is, from evolutionary biology, there is something like a Dunbar number, which says something why human tribes thousands of years ago never grew over a certain threshold from maybe 120 people. And that's a number which you find back in many circumstances. Intellectually, our brain capacity cannot capture more in an emotional way more than 120 people. So people who say I have 500 friends just lie because it's impossible. You can only actually configure in your mind a certain number of people, and the maximum seems to be 120. A tribe was functioning on social norms, so it made it necessary that everyone knew everyone somehow and could judge everyone, and that ends with a certain size because then the social structure breaks down, it gets too large. I mean, we have laws, we found many regulations, we have other mechanisms of being a larger community, but former tribes were depending on actually the social network and the imagination of everyone and social norms. And therefore, the Dunbar number was once calculated. Does it make sense? Yes. That's a very negative thing, what happened. But also there, it could be, in hindsight, it would have been better if explaining it before. That's 11 September in the United States, and also those terrorists worked in networks and had different functions and were distributed over the network with different responsibilities. If you just take an easy calculation in degree and betweenness, you have two different persons. And the betweenness persons are mostly the persons behind the scenes, and the degree persons are in front of it. So I remember those times that also CIA and all the secret services started to investigate in social networks and the functioning of social networks, because when fighting terrorists, it's extremely important to know about the network structures. Because taking out certain persons would destroy the entire network. Social capital, often used, and you have to distinguish two things. Of course, social networks provide you social capital, and you can calculate roles and you can do statistics on it, fine. But social networks can also be negative, what we call social liability. You also could be in network structures that stop you doing something useful, that hinder or are a barrier for your own way. So social networks are not always positive. Social networks can be really negative. But taking the positive view of social capital, there are two sides. That's the ties or the resources to whom you are connected. There are your resources. And that can be very different. You can be connected to a rich guy investing in your startup, but you could have also a very close emotional friend supporting you when you are very ill. So resources can be very different. But of course you have this resource side, and you have the structural form, if it is open or closed, what I'm just referring to. And that, in the end, creates your social capital. By the way, most things in your life happen through social networks. You probably study what you studied because the social network was leading you to that. You find your partner in social networks. Where else? You find probably your first job in social networks. So most things in your life are determined by the network you are in. Coming back to the discussion about theory. When we really want to use networks as a statistical method and prove something, we need to know So original structure, what's the null hypothesis? Are networks random, normally distributed networks, or are networks scale-free or very biasedly distributed? It means take the World Wide Web, or take whatever network, Instagram, or WhatsApp, or whatever you take. Do the people have equal distribution of contacts? That meaning some people have a few, some people have many, and it distributes like a normal distribution. Do we assume that as this network distribution, or do we assume that it's very biased? So most people don't have many contacts, and there are a few that have many of them. So the first would refer to a quite random, normally distributed distribution, which is normal, which we would expect is nothing special, would be our null hypothesis, or do we expect an extremely biased distribution? To give you an example here, if it would be normally distributed and we have a virus, this virus would spread like that in the United States. Normally from town to town, equally over the whole country in the same speed. Quite predictable. If not, if we have a scale-free power law distribution, it would spread like that. So now see yourself in a situation right now as epidemiologist, and you have to predict the spread of COVID-19. Quite difficult if you don't have a null hypothesis. So you need to have an idea how networks actually work, how they are distributed. And that's still a discussion among very different disciplines. It's still not solved. As a rule of thumb, as smaller networks are that you consider, if I take only your year group or this module here, where we have 65 people enrolled here. It's a rather small network if I take that as group. In this group, I count the number of contacts everyone has. And it will probably result in a quite normally distributed picture because it's a small group. If I take the World Wide Web, it certainly will result in a really biased structure where you have a few players which many links, and the most players do not have many links. So depending on the size of the networks that are considered, it goes from normal to very biased scale-free distribution. So in the current situation, as epidemiologist, I would say, okay, we have to take that as null hypothesis because the general structure of all people will probably be that there are a few people with many contacts, and most people do not have so many contacts. And then you come up with a structure. You have this kind of super spreaders, people who infect hundreds of people, and the most people do not infect anyone. And the same you found back in the research to AIDS, that you had central actors being extremely active and who took care in spreading it a lot, and most actors didn't do it. So actually this biased and normally distributed structure is a common structure if you take larger networks, but you have to keep it in mind when doing statistics, that it's not normally distributed. When doing so, I actually want you also to learn about a software which is free. And that's the most easiest software used for social network analytics, and that's UCINet. And I also want you to do a small assignment for the last lecture when you do. Just imagine there are 10 people on a lonely island, and you measure two networks. Your first network is kinship, so are there relatives, brother, sister, parents, non-parents. Second network is, are there really friends? So you would expect that it correlates quite high, but not necessarily. You can calculate certain positions. You can imagine that's the easy setting. Having a lonely island, 10 persons. Some persons are relatives, others not, and there's some friendship or not. And then you can correlate it. So kinship, friendship. So the most obvious hypothesis would be here, there is no correlation. The friendship network does not correlate to the kinship network. You also could say, okay, brothers and sisters don't like each other, so probably it correlates negatively. Although you could say relatives like each other much more, so it correlates positively. So there are certain hypotheses possible, but you could take the most easiest one, alternatives, there is a relationship, or there is no relationship. And then you test it, and you can actually test it. There are actually proceedings. Quadratic assignment procedure is like a correlation between matrices, and we find a correlation of 0.6 and a positive correlation. So, and it's also significant. So it's only 1% likely, or less than 1% likely, that we find that the null hypothesis is true. So we have to reject the null hypothesis. There is a relationship, and that's positive, as we see, and it's pretty high. So kinship and friendship comes together. You could also calculate a regression. So kinship predicts friendship. So also networks allow to predict in the same way as I explained it with a regression. So also this UCINet can be used for simple regressions on networks. And you can calculate a lot of individual facts. You can calculate for every team member the Betweener centrality, the degree centrality, this network efficiency, all the things we have discussed now. You can calculate for every single team member and look whether the network is efficient or it's high in degree centrality, is in the middle of the information flows, and so on. And what I would like you to do is once, just as exercise, going into it's pretty easy, the whole program, and there are a lot of examples in the program of real studies that have been published over the last 30 years with the real data. So you can take this data that are loaded in the program and play around a bit and maybe formulate a hypothesis and test a hypothesis. You can also use this program. It has included a program, NetDraw, where you can actually make nice graphics out of networks. So you can also play around with all the algorithm behind it to display that. It's also a program when you once enter into social network analytics at your master thesis or whatever you do, it's really handy to do something in there. It has a quite simple structure. It shows you where you can statistics. It shows you what all you can calculate. It shows you that you can make drawings in different kinds. So I'm not grading it. I'm not making it mandatory. But it would be nice to produce it and send it to me. I also will put it on ISIS to use it and send it to me, and we will present it at the next lecture here, or at the lecture about using Python artificial intelligence as a method in business research. So there's also a video you can use. I uploaded on ISIS, and the assignment is to look for a data set that you're interested in. There are data about wolves and developments of tribes of wolves. You have data about management teams. You have data about company boards, external, internal, about countries. So there are many, many various data there. But you can look where you're interested in that are real data, and you can play around with that with using UCINet and using the data, formulating a hypothesis, testing the hypothesis. In one or another way, you can test that with this program. Okay, thanks a lot so far about social network analytics as short introduction into the topic and the field when using it as an analytic topic. Okay, thanks.